On the morning of May 10, 1940, the first news bulletins began to crackle across American radios with a crushing weight. The German army had invaded the Low Countries, and the air was suddenly thick with the thunder of tanks and dive bombers crushing Luxembourg, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Shock quickly turned to alarm as reports described an offensive that seemed to move with a speed the world had never witnessed. One member of the United States House of Representatives, standing before his colleagues that morning, cried out that nobody could see through the curtain of battle smoke enshrouding the earth. Another representative spoke for many of his countrymen when he shouted that hell was out of bounds. Speculations that had seemed fantastic only months earlier were now horrifying possibilities as Hitler rolled toward France and the English Channel. The last great democracy on earth suddenly looked across the ocean and wondered how it would defend itself if it were attacked. While the radio voices brought the sound of fire from abroad, the daily life inside the munitions building on Constitution Avenue remained quiet. The structure was a temporary wood and concrete relic of the First World War housing. The men tasked with arming the nation, Major General Charles M. Wesson, the Chief of Ordnance, sat at his desk and prepared for his morning conferences within a headquarters staff that numbered only 400 people. In the atmosphere of May 1940, the Ordnance Department was a small family of 56 regular Army officers and 341 civilians. Wesson met every morning with Brigadier General Charles T. Harris, Jr., a plain-spoken officer who served as the dynamo of the industrial service. They were joined by Colonel James K. Crane, a slender man who looked more like a college professor than a soldier as he managed the field service. How did the Ordnance Department transition from a neglected pre-war agency to a mass-production powerhouse capable of sustaining global warfare? And how did it manage the distribution of that output? In late May, the true state of the nation's defenses was laid bare on the floor of Congress, and the revelation caused an immediate uproar. There were not enough effective anti-aircraft guns to defend even a single large municipality in the entire country. Coast defense guns still guarded the shores, but some had not been fired for 20 years, and all could be bombed out of existence by carrier-based planes. The field artillery was a remnant of a previous generation, consisting of 5,000 French 75mm guns left over from the First World War. Nearly all were mounted on big wooden wheels with steel tires made to be drawn by mules or horses at a slow walk. If these guns were towed by a modern truck at high speed over rough ground, they would be shaken to pieces in a few miles. Only 141 of these ancient pieces had been modernized with pneumatic tires and improved carriages. The companion piece, the new 105mm howitzer, was just entering production, but not a single one was on hand. It would take 14 to 16 months to produce the 48 howitzers, for which funds had already been provided. To understand the alarm in Washington, we must look at the weapons themselves. General Wesson had to face angry lawmakers who demanded to know where the money had gone during the years of peace. He explained that about 3/4 of the billions appropriated for the army had been spent on the maintenance of a volunteer force scattered over many small posts. Food and travel expenses had consumed the budget, leaving little for weapons that required a long lead time to manufacture. General Malin Craig, a former chief of staff, had recently warned that funds appropriated today would not be transformed into military power for at least 2 years. General George C. Marshall was more prophetic, telling the Senate that he thought the nation could be ready for war by December 1941. But many senators were disappointed by this attitude, noting that wars were now being settled in 30 days, while the army planned on a scale of years. The ability of the United States to wage tank warfare was perhaps the darkest spot in the entire military picture. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, fresh from maneuvers in the fields of Louisiana, reported that he had seen all the tanks in the entire United States. They numbered only about 400, a total equivalent to a single finger of the fan-like German advance crushing France. The Germans were believed to have 3,000 tanks, while almost all American models were the light type weighing only 10 or 12 tons. To stop these steel giants, the Army relied on the 37mm anti-tank gun, but the United States possessed only 218 of those weapons. When President Roosevelt told the country we had 792 tanks on hand or on order, the press was quick to correct the record. Note the disparity between the president's promises and the cold reality of the inventory. Complete delivery of the weapons mentioned in that fireside chat could not be expected before June 1941. Amidst the gloom of the heavy weapons, the small arms situation offered a rare moment of encouragement for the men in the munitions building. There were enough machine guns in the stockpile, and the army held some 2.5 million rifles in its depots. About 35,000 of these were the new Garand semi-automatic rifles, a rapid-firing weapon that was finally gaining ground. At the Springfield Armory, workmen were turning out 4,000 of these rifles every month to meet the rising demand. Yet a rifle is only as dangerous as the ammunition supplied to the man carrying it, and those figures were discouraging. The stock of 50 caliber ball ammunition was only 25 million rounds, and there were only 17 million rounds of 30 caliber armor-piercing ammunition. The sudden importance of the bomber plane threw a glaring light on the pitifully small supply of bombs. There were only 11,928 bombs of the 500-pound size, and only 4,336 of the 1,000-pound type. The anxious weeks of June 1940 brought a series of disasters that made prototype delays seem trivial. On June 3rd, the British were driven off the continent at Dunkirk, leaving their heavy equipment in the sand. Paris surrendered on June 14th, and the world watched as Hitler stood before the Eiffel Tower. The fall of France marked the real beginning of America's rearmament, and the pace in Washington changed from a walk to a sprint. General Wesson and General Harris knew that the 6 ordnance arsenals would never be able to produce more than 5% of the munitions needed. The arsenals were valuable mainly as centers of technical knowledge where the art of design was kept alive. In June, Wesson watched as his men worked feverishly to get abandoned plants back into shape to start production. The haunting presence of time was now in the room, with every officer who looked at a blueprint or a contract. Looking at the wreckage of the European balance of power, the General Staff moved to authorize a program that dwarfed everything that had come before. The munitions program of June 30th, 1940, was a massive commitment that fundamentally altered the Ordnance Department's mission. It called for the immediate procurement of equipment for 1,200,000 ground troops. Long lead time items were to be purchased for a force of 2 million, and the capacity was to be created for an even larger army on combat status. One of the key architects of this program was an ordnance officer, Colonel James H. Burns. The plan cleared the way for the creation of massive munitions plants, and General Harris began the task of putting private industry to work. He knew that it took an inexorable number of months to build a powder plant or make a tank. To meet the demands of the new program, Ordnance had to create an ammunition industry where almost none existed. There were no commercial plants in the United States that could be readily converted to produce smokeless powder or high explosives. General Harris had spent years coordinating with the small peacetime explosives industry to draw up plans for typical plants. In the first weeks of July 1940, the department awarded 1,450 contracts to industry. The value of these orders for weapons, ammunition, and machinery reached $83 million. A single contract for a $26 million smokeless powder plant went to the DuPont Company. Other orders for millions of artillery shells were divided among firms like the United States Steel Corporation and the Budd Wheel Company. Working through the summer heat, staff officers in Washington struggled to balance the flow of components to final assembly points. While the industrial side of the department was exploding in size, the field service was also undergoing a transformation. Colonel James K. Crane had recently engineered a change in how maintenance was organized in the field. He grouped individual ordnance companies into a single ordnance battalion to provide a mobile maintenance team. During the maneuvers of 1940, Crane watched as this new organization successfully kept vehicles moving. He saw that for the first time in history, the Army was equipped with enough motor transportation to carry weapons, food, and men. His field service was elevated to the same level as the industrial service, and Crane would soon wear the stars of a general. By the end of July, the foundations of the powerhouse were in place, though the weapons were still mostly on paper. In the sweltering August of 1940, the center of gravity in the Ordnance Department began to shift away from the desks of Washington toward the machine shops and foundries of the American Heartland. 13 regional procurement districts were activated that month, establishing a network of offices in cities from Boston to San Francisco. Notice how the map of the country was suddenly redrawn, with industrial zones replacing state lines in the minds of the men tasked with arming the nation. Each district office was headed by a prominent local businessman who served as a bridge to private industry, paired with a regular Army executive officer who navigated the intricate regulations of the service. Major General Charles M. Wesson knew that this decentralized system was the only way to manage a program that would eventually involve thousands of prime contracts and millions of components. Brigadier General Charles T. Harris, Jr., acting as the dynamo of the industrial service, relied on these district chiefs to unlock industrial doors that had been closed to the military for 20 years. In New York, the district board included such prominent figures as Patrick E. Crowley of the New York Central Lines and James A. Farrell of the United States Steel Corporation. These advisory boards provided a crucial layer of civilian prestige that convinced skeptical factory owners to convert their plants to war production. The activation of these offices marked a fundamental change as the department moved from the quiet planning of the 1930s into the frantic activity of a national emergency. To understand the speed of this transformation, we must look at the legacy of the Educational Orders Program, which had been approved by Congress in 1938. General Harris had utilized these small, experimental contracts to allow private firms to stumble through the complexities of making a modern weapon before the real pressure of war arrived. Winchester Repeating Arms was one of the early participants, receiving a $1 million contract to prepare for the production of the new service rifle. The company later estimated that this period of trial and error saved a full year of time in reaching the capacity required for a modern infantry. By the autumn of 1940, the experimental phase was over, and educational orders were rapidly replaced by massive production contracts. General Harris watched as the small-scale training of the reserve industry was transformed into a full-speed sprint to meet the targets of the munitions program. While prototypes were still being tested, the district offices began soliciting bids for millions of artillery shells and bomb bodies. The process was an educational experience for the Ordnance Department itself, as officers learned how to share their technical knowledge with men used to making automobiles and sewing machines. At the Springfield Armory, a civilian engineer named John C. Garand worked in the model shop to perfect the rifle that would soon become the standard weapon of the American soldier. His gas-operated design utilized an 8-round clip and weighed approximately 9.5 pounds, offering a rate of fire that promised to change the nature of infantry combat. Garand had spent years in the drafting rooms of the armory, carefully refining the 70 parts that made up his semi-automatic masterpiece. He had to navigate intense technical scrutiny and a storm of public controversy as critics questioned the reliability of his weapon compared to the older bolt-action Springfield. General Wesson stood by the design, insisting that the Garand was the finest service rifle in the world and that any initial defects were merely growing pains of mass production. The armory was forced to undergo a massive retooling program to reach the goal of 1,000 rifles every day. Workers in Springfield installed hundreds of new machine tools and furnaces, often replacing equipment that had been in use since the 19th century. By the spring of 1941, the rhythmic clatter of the assembly lines was a sign that the department was successfully bridging the gap between a toolroom pilot and a mass-produced weapon. You might see in these vast western valleys the first signs of a nation mobilizing its geographic depth for a global struggle. General Harris and his staff had to create an entirely new ammunition industry because private firms could not afford to build the massive facilities required for explosives and loading. They developed a model known as government-owned contractor-operated plants, where the military provided the capital and industry provided the management. Ground was broken the day after Christmas in 1940 for the Lake City plant in Missouri, the first of many massive reservations that would soon populate the interior of the country. Soon, construction began on similar facilities in Denver, Colorado, and St. Louis, Missouri. The Denver plant alone covered 2,000 acres and required more than 200 buildings to house its production lines and laboratories. These sites were chosen far from the coastlines to protect them from air or sea attack, creating a new geography of munitions in the heart of the continent. The logistical challenge of coordinating these projects was immense, as every plant required its own railroad tracks, hospitals, and police forces. General Harris was the guiding hand behind this facilities program, pushing contractors to finish construction months ahead of their original estimates. The search for heavy armor took the department to the automotive capital of Detroit, where a new partnership was formed with the Chrysler Corporation. In September of 1940, ground was broken for the Detroit Tank Arsenal on a 100-acre tract of flat Michigan farmland. Mr. K.T. Keller, the president of Chrysler, had agreed to the project after a single weekend of study and a direct appeal from the government. His engineers had to translate 10,000 separate drawings into a functional assembly line for the medium tank, a vehicle they had never before built. At the same time, design work on the new M3 tank was still in progress, forcing the department to build the factory while the blueprints were still being drawn. General Harris and his procurement officers worked closely with the auto industry to simplify manufacturing methods and save precious machine tool time. In April of 1941, the first medium tank rolled off the line in Detroit, a gift to the government from the Chrysler dealers of the nation. Additional orders were placed with railway equipment companies like Baldwin and American Locomotive to widen the production base even further. The haunting presence of time was always in the room, as every delay in a transmission or a gun mount threatened to halt the entire program. While the factories rose, Major General James K. Crane was tasked with finding a place to store the coming flood of weapons and powder. He looked more like a college professor than a soldier, but Crane possessed a deep understanding of the mistakes made during the First World War. He knew that a dangerous concentration of ammunition on the Atlantic coast could invite disaster, and he pushed for a new network of depots in the interior. Crane utilized the experience of ammunition storage experts to select sites that were isolated from large cities but possessed strong railroad connections. His plan introduced the use of igloos, which were earth-covered structures of reinforced concrete, designed to direct the force of an explosion upward rather than outward. By the autumn of 1941, construction was well advanced on 8 new ammunition depots located across the country. Ammunition was already flowing into safe storage at Umatilla, Portage, Wingate, and Anniston before the end of the year. Each of these depots covered thousands of acres, providing a vast buffer zone that would safeguard neighboring communities from the dangers of the explosive cargo. Notice the scale of these reservations, some of which were larger than the municipal areas of the great cities they defended. As the calendar moved toward November 1941, the dynamo of American industry was finally beginning to hum with a purposeful, rhythmic power. General Wesson and his staff in the munitions building could look at a landscape that had been transformed in less than 18 months. 17 massive government-owned plants were already in production, and dozens more were rising from the mud of the Midwest and the South. The district procurement offices had become bustling centers of activity, overseeing hundreds of prime contracts that reached into every corner of the economy. The M1 rifle was being produced by the thousands, and the first medium tanks were undergoing grueling tests at the proving grounds. The foundations of the mass production powerhouse were now firmly in place, even as the international situation grew more ominous each day. Every officer who looked at a production report knew that the nation was closer to readiness than it had been in a generation. The department had successfully translated billions of dollars and years of planning into a network of functional factories and depots. How did the Ordnance Department transition from a neglected pre-war agency to a mass production powerhouse capable of sustaining global warfare? The answer was found in the smoke of the new foundries and the orderly rows of igloos stretching across the American plains. Share your family stories from the home front or the factory lines in the comments below. We invite you to subscribe and like this essay as we continue to bring these forgotten moments of our history back to life. There are many more stories left to tell about the men and women who built the arsenal of democracy. Just weeks after the smoke cleared at Pearl Harbor, on January 3, 1942, the Ordnance Department was confronted with a set of figures that seemed to defy the limits of industrial reality. President Roosevelt sent a secret letter to the Secretary of War that morning, calling for the production of 45,000 tanks and some 500,000 machine guns within a single year. This new directive marked a fundamental shift in the department, as the primary constraint on every decision changed from the availability of money to the inexorable pressure of time. Major General Charles M. Wesson and Major General Charles T. Harris, Jr. looked at these goals and realized the mass production powerhouse they had built would have to be doubled in size again. The logistical challenge was no longer just about building factories. It had become a struggle with the complex arithmetic of global requirements. To understand the burden on the staff in Washington, you must realize that every gun and vehicle was the end result of a calculation involving thousands of separate parts and millions of men. How did the men in the munitions building determine exactly what to build when the map of the war was changing every hour? The task of calculating these needs fell to the Requirements Division, where officers worked to balance the size of the army against the capacity of the nation's steel mills. Planners used a master document known as the Troop Basis, which listed every unit in existence or scheduled for activation in the coming months. To arrive at a final number, they multiplied the quantity of each item authorized for a specific unit by the number of those units in the field. This process was a demanding and tedious labor that required the constant revision of thousands of tables of equipment as tactical lessons arrived from the front. A single infantry regiment, for instance, might require 2,099 rifles one year, only to have that authorized amount drop to 1,600 the next. The math became even more erratic when planners accounted for the replacement factor. Ran estimate of how much equipment would be lost to the enemy or worn out by the weather. General Wesson often observed that this was not merely a matter of cold logic, but a psychological game where planners turned bullish when the news was good and bearish when the tides turned. In the middle of this statistical storm, on May 20, 1942, Major General Levin H. Campbell, Jr. stepped into the role of Chief of Ordnance as General Wesson retired from the service. Campbell arrived at a moment when the department was about to undergo its largest expansion in history. By the end of that summer, on August 1, 1942, the War Department issued a circular that transferred the entire motor transport mission from the Quartermaster Corps to the Ordnance Department. Major General James K. Crane, who had spent his life managing the distribution of munitions, suddenly found himself responsible for over 1 million transport vehicles. This merger brought some 4,000 new contracts and a staggering variety of 330 different models of cars and trucks into the ordnance supply system. It established a new partnership between the military and the automotive capital of Detroit, centering all vehicle procurement in a single technical service. But the transfer also exposed a critical weakness in how the Army identified the parts needed to keep those wheels turning. While the factories were pouring out new trucks, the men in the field were struggling with a linguistic crisis known as the numbers racket. A single bearing manufactured by one company could be used in a Ford, a Chrysler, and a Plymouth, but it often carried a different identification number for every vehicle. By the autumn of 1942, there were no less than 7 different parts numbering systems being used simultaneously across the department. Colonel Crane and his staff in the field service realized that a mechanic in a desert repair shop might have the part he needed in a crate right next to him without ever knowing it. To solve this, the department began the massive task of assigning a single official stock number to every component in the inventory. The use of electrical accounting machines made by the International Business Machines Corporation was intended to speed up this work, but the changeover was often hindered by a lack of trained operators. In Detroit, the Consolidated Stores reports were sometimes a full month behind, creating a bottleneck that threatened the orderly flow of supplies to the coast. Consider the physical scale of this problem, where a single 2.5-ton truck might have over 1,000 different spare parts required for maintenance. The department moved to establish the Master Depot system, a plan to concentrate all the parts for a specific make of vehicle in a single location. Under this concept, a depot like Rossford would become the primary source for automotive parts, while Lordstown handled the bulk of the tools and equipment. This was the quiet human labor of the war, performed by thousands of clerks and warehousemen who spent their days counting washers and sorting gaskets. General Campbell knew that the strike of a single key on a tabulating machine could be as vital to a campaign as the pull of a trigger on a Garand rifle. He often argued that the best maintenance system would fail if a soldier repairing a broken truck lacked the right part at the right time. The department was learning that while building the arsenal was an industrial triumph, managing its contents was a scientific necessity. The year 1942 also revealed a disturbing lack of maintenance discipline among the young men tasked with driving the Army's new motor fleet. A spot check of 5 divisions that autumn revealed that nearly half of all vehicles were improperly lubricated or running with underinflated tires. General Crane saw that the average American soldier, while mechanically inclined, was often inherently wasteful with the equipment provided by the government. To combat this neglect, Ordnance launched the Preventive Maintenance Program, an educational campaign that utilized posters and a magazine called Army Motors. You might have seen the Joe Dope cartoons on the walls of every motor pool, using humor and catchy rhymes to teach the importance of checking a battery or a steering gear. The department also recruited some 1,600 civilian automotive advisors from the executive officers of the major car companies to serve as instructors in the field. These experts worked directly with the troops to ensure that a truck engine designed to last years did not burn out in its first month of service. By late December, the deadline report showed that this emphasis on care was beginning to pay dividends in a more reliable and efficient motor force. While these organizational changes took hold, the department also dealt with the tragic reality of industrial accidents on the home front. On June 5, 1942, an explosion at the Elwood Ordnance Plant killed 48 people and caused nearly $500,000 in property damage. This disaster, occurring on a line where anti-tank mines were being loaded, was a sobering reminder of the hazards inherent in the ammunition program. General Campbell responded by establishing the Safety and Security Branch in Chicago to oversee the dangerous work performed in the government-owned plants. He insisted that while production goals were urgent, the life of a worker on the line was a resource the nation could not afford to lose. The department began training safety auditors who inspected every building to ensure that standard procedures were followed to the letter. It was a year of learning the true cost of mobilization, from the lives lost in Missouri to the millions of man-hours spent on bookkeeping in Michigan. As the first year of the war drew to a close in December, the Ordnance Department had successfully integrated a massive new mission while navigating the shifting tides of planning. The army of 4 million men was taking shape, and the supplies were moving into a distribution network that reached across the continent. The 25,000 tanks produced that year fell short of the president's original dream, but they represented a capacity that no other nation could match. The 2.5-ton truck had earned its place as the workhorse of the service, while the new amphibian truck, the Duquo, was proving its value in the waters of the Pacific. The master depot system was beginning to function with a rhythmic efficiency that promised to keep the supply lines fluid. Every officer in the munitions building understood that the coming year would bring an even greater demand for the weapons of the ground forces. The department had successfully transitioned from the frantic expansion of 1941 into the disciplined arithmetic of 1942. By the arrival of 1943, the rhythm of the Ordnance Department had changed from the frantic construction of buildings to the steady, high-pressure output of the weapons themselves. The arsenal was no longer a collection of blueprints and mud-filled construction sites, but a functional engine that measured its success by the tonnage of steel shipped to the front. Major General Levin H. Campbell, Jr. now directed a department that had moved its center of gravity for tanks and trucks to the Union Guardian building in Detroit. Notice how the focus of the war had shifted from the defensive anxiety of the early years to the cold requirement of sustaining a global offensive. The Sherman tank became the visible symbol of this new era, rolling off assembly lines at a pace that eventually reached 4,000 units every month. Look closely at a medium tank from this period, and you will see an industrial miracle composed of over 14,000 individual pieces of steel. To keep these machines moving, the department had to manage a chaotic variety of engines, from the Chrysler Multibank to the General Motors twin diesel. General Campbell and his staff at the Tank Automotive Center realized that the diversity of these power plants was a logistical burden, yet they had to use every available engine to meet the high production goals of 1943. The Sherman was not merely a weapon, it was a testament to the ability of the automotive industry to merge its competitive interests into a single, unified effort. You might see in the assembly of these vehicles the success of the industry integration committees that were now active across the country. In the spring of 1943, the department organized a specific group to oversee the production of the mechanical time fuse, a device as delicate as a wristwatch, but built to withstand the shock of being fired from a cannon. Roy T. Hurley, an executive from Bendix Aviation, gathered representatives from 6 rival firms around a single table to share manufacturing secrets they had guarded for decades. Hurley made a forceful gesture of cooperation by placing the entire technical staff of his company at the disposal of his competitors to ensure that no factory fell behind the schedule. This committee managed to double the output of fuses within 4 months, while simultaneously reducing the cost of each unit to the government. Such quiet collaboration in the boardrooms of the Midwest was what allowed the department to reach a peak production of $5 billion worth of ammunition in a single year. It was a moment when the traditional boundaries of private business were erased by the shared necessity of national survival. The chemical side of this powerhouse was transformed by an accidental discovery that changed the way the department manufactured high explosives. Colonel John P. Harris visited a small Canadian factory near Montreal and observed that the workers there were performing the nitration of explosives in a manner completely opposite to American practice. By adding the toluene to the acid, instead of the acid to the toluene, the Canadians had found a way to triple the output of a single production line. General Campbell and his ammunition specialists quickly adopted this method of reverse nitration in all domestic plants, effectively ending the shortage of high explosives that had haunted the service since 1941. This technical breakthrough allowed the cost of trinitrotoluene to drop from 12 cents a pound to 6 cents in less than a year. At the same time, the department began producing toluene from petroleum at the Baytown Ordnance Works in Texas, using a process developed in partnership with the oil industry. By the middle of 1943, the United States was producing more toluene from a single refinery than the entire nation had produced during the First World War. These scientific victories ensured that the fist of the fighting forces would never lack the power to strike. As the summer of 1943 turned to autumn, a dangerous sentiment began to take hold among the planners in Washington. The success of the campaign in North Africa, which was a war of rapid movement over desert sands, led many to believe that the army had already produced more ammunition than it would ever need. The Procurement Review Board, headed by Major General Frank R. McCoy, reported that reserves of shells and bombs were reaching astronomical levels. Acting on this advice, the War Department began a series of drastic cutbacks, closing down dozens of production lines and dismantling the very capacity that had been built at such great expense. General Campbell and his ammunition experts protested these decisions, warning that a war against fortified positions in Europe would require a volume of fire that the desert campaigns had not yet seen. Their objections were largely ignored by the High Command, which was then focused on conserving steel and manpower for other programs. This period of retrenchment resulted in the shutdown of 6 massive ammunition plants and the diversion of their workers to other industries. It was a choice made in the hope of efficiency that would soon be tested by the harsh reality of the battlefield. In the heat of the summer of 1944, the landing of Allied troops in Normandy suddenly exposed the error of the previous year's cutbacks. The invasion of France was not a war of movement, but a brutal struggle against concrete bunkers and heavy German armor that required a constant heavy rain of steel. General Eisenhower sent urgent cables back to Washington, reporting that his armies were facing a serious shortage of heavy artillery ammunition. The department was suddenly ordered to restart its heavy shell program on a blitz basis, attempting to rebuild capacity that had been discarded only months before. This crisis forced the Ordnance Department to double its production of heavy shells in just 7 months, a task that required the recruitment of thousands of new workers and the installation of massive forging presses. To meet the demand, the department had to furlough soldiers from training camps and send them back to the factories to work on the assembly lines. Women were recruited in record numbers to fill the vacancies in the loading plants, eventually making up more than half of the workforce at some installations. The struggle to restart the engine of heavy production was a sobering lesson in the danger of interrupting the flow of a mass production powerhouse. To manage the distribution of this hardware, Major General James K. Crane and his staff in the field service introduced the Master Depot system in the spring of 1944. They realized that the traditional method of storing a little of everything at every depot was creating a bottleneck that delayed shipments to the ports. On the advice of industrial leaders like Lewis H. Brown and K.T. Keller, the department began concentrating all the parts for a specific make of vehicle at a single specialized location. A depot like Rossford became the primary home for every bolt and bearing needed for a Chevrolet truck, while another facility handled only the parts for the Dodge fleet. This system allowed warehouse workers to become experts in a narrow range of equipment, speeding up the process of filling requisitions for the overseas theaters. General Crane pushed for the use of functional assemblies, where spare parts were packed in small, ready-to-use kits rather than in massive 100-pound boxes. These improvements in the quiet work of storage were as vital to the liberation of Europe as the production of the guns themselves. The department was learning that the language of supply had to be as precise as the engineering of a tank transmission. By the arrival of December 1944, the Ordnance Department was supporting an army that was firing shells at a rate never before imagined in human history. In that single month, American artillery units in Europe fired more than 3 million rounds of 105mm howitzer ammunition. The supply lines now reached from the factories of the American Heartland to the front lines of the Ardennes, moving thousands of carloads of materiel every week. The direct shipment program, which bypassed the inland depots and sent ammunition straight from the loading plants to the ports, was saving millions of dollars and thousands of car days. Every shell that reached a gunner in France was the end result of a 5,000-mile journey, coordinated by the clerks and officers in Philadelphia and St. Louis. The department had successfully weathered the production crisis of 1944 and was now operating at a velocity that the enemy could not hope to match. The arithmetic of war had finally been mastered, ensuring that the ground forces would have the overwhelming weight of fire required for the final push into Germany. General Campbell could look at his production reports and see that the powerhouse was finally running at full speed, though the cost of the earlier delays was still being paid on the battlefield. The winter of 1945 began with a frantic effort to restore the massive reserves of ammunition that had been depleted during the heavy fighting in the Ardennes. By the arrival of January, the Ordnance Department was managing its highest production requirements of the entire conflict, with goals set for 25,000 new tanks and billions of rounds of machine gun ammunition. Major General Levin H. Campbell, Jr. pushed the department to its absolute limit, ensuring that the ground forces possessed a masterly weight of fire for the final assault on Germany. You should observe that by this final stage of the war, the scientific methods of the department had achieved a nearly impossible level of precision. Consider the fact that the rate of serious malfunctions in artillery shells had dropped to less than 1 in 100,000 rounds fired. The department utilized statistical quality control to ensure that the quality of every cartridge was verified before it ever reached the hands of a soldier. Just weeks after the victory in Europe, the focus shifted entirely toward the Pacific. But this momentum was soon interrupted by a technical revolution that changed the nature of warfare forever. In the heat of August 1945, the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, bringing the conflict to a sudden and absolute conclusion. On the evening of August 14th, the Chief of Ordnance received a letter from the Army Service Forces directing him to halt the production engine immediately. The department sent out over 11,000 termination telegrams that night, effectively stopping the flow of the very powerhouse it had spent 5 years building. This transition marked the beginning of a final reckoning with the thousands of contracts that had sustained the global struggle. Major General Charles T. Harris, Jr. and the procurement staff turned their attention from the manufacturing of weapons to the fair settlement of industrial claims. To understand the integrity of this process, you must realize that Ordnance placed billions of dollars in contracts without a single instance of proven graft or corruption. The department implemented a policy of negotiated settlements to avoid the long, agonizing audits that had followed the previous World War. By the end of 1945, the Ordnance Department had successfully settled the vast majority of its outstanding obligations, allowing American industry to begin the work of peace. Major General Levin H. Campbell, Jr. eventually retired from the service and recorded the history of this era in his book, The Industry Ordnance Team. Major General Charles T. Harris, Jr. led a special committee to plan the future of the department, advocating for a permanent partnership between the military and the scientific community. Major General James K. Crane, the professor-like engineer of the field service, oversaw the return of millions of tons of ammunition from the battlefields to the safety of domestic igloos. These men, who had seen the department grow from a neglected pre-war agency into a global powerhouse, now worked to ensure its lessons would never be forgotten. How did a small staff in the munitions building manage to sustain the greatest army in human history while navigating the chaos of a two-front war? The answer is found not in the vast tonnage of steel, but in the quiet, disciplined labor of the men and women who mastered the arithmetic of national survival. Take a moment to look at the face of a returning veteran as he examines a rifle that functioned perfectly in the mud of a distant island. He does not see the billions of dollars or the millions of ledger entries that brought that weapon to his side. He only knows that when he reached for a spare part or a fresh clip of ammunition, the department had ensured it was there, waiting for him. This is the true legacy of the Ordnance Department, a commitment to quality that protected the lives of those who defended our democracy. I hope you can see that the story of these weapons is ultimately a human one, defined by the integrity of the people who designed, built, and delivered them. The arsenal of democracy was more than a collection of factories. It was a testament to the ability of a free people to merge their strength into a single, irresistible force.